I think it was a sin. So that's probably why it's not weird.
I just could see like a little. I think you could even do like a. I got no tips for you.
I just gotta get out. Yeah, it's singing it in my chest. Yeah, that's what I got down. But I had it. I just like,
you know what I mean? Like the first part where he's singing. Or maybe you can do like the whole first and then like the whole second bit he's singing.
For my solo, I feel like someone, I don't know, I feel like someone was holding a D for too long. Like I wasn't hearing like the blues.
Yeah, I think I swapped too late on one of this. That was my fault.
Okay, yeah, that's fine.
Let's we gotta try and get we were saying I'll do just for that little second. We're just going all the way off. Just like take it easy. Yeah, perfect. Just go sounding good. You kind of play drums sometimes. You get better. You've done that. Like you sound. Wait, what is that? Let me do that.
You're like doing the grand, right? Grand?
Yeah.
I will use this keyboard.
Okay. Yeah. Why just piano over organ? Piano over organ? Is that good? Yeah. Because like piano is like the thing, but if you do organ, you can just be like get connections.
Give some soul.
You can do like a little yeah, electro. Oh, you can scale.
Okay, so we get a little more vocal out of just that front monitor for Perry. Alright guys, probably
Testing. Oh, yes.
One more. We can maybe even run it twice.
Oh, I got plenty.
Yeah, let's just run it.
I guess I was a little shaky on your solo.
Yeah, I was saying that
I changed the late. That was my
yeah,
bad.
someone wasn't like doing the chord changes correct for my solo.
Like how many times does it change? Like I was talking about, like, or like I was like a little bit confused about the vocal part after my solo, after mine and Noah's solo. Like I think we played it way more than 2 choruses.
No, we just did 2. Well, he stopped after 1, and I told him.
Yeah, that was my fault. I was supposed to repeat. Yeah.
And then what you did, so that's normal length. And then the structure for my solo is the same as the verses in your solos.
Yeah,
Besides that bass, but
yeah. Besides the bass, it sounds really weird, dude. Like I'm trying. I was playing the chord progression. It just sounded really weird with the bass.
no, I think
I changed the yeah, I didn't change. So let's try it again and we'll get 2 solos, see if it fits better.
All right.
Actually look
Because I was gonna jump. No, because like, dude, I was gonna jump in with the chord progression, but like it didn't sound what the bass was doing.
yeah,
And I didn't want to fuck up your solo. Because what you were doing sounded cool. I was like, holy shit.
No, I respect that. Yeah, I respect it. Let's just run it again. Phil is sounding great.
Yeah, he's gonna take the second verse. Phil.
Testing 1, 2. Yes, that is a hot mic. Yes, thank you so much.
A lot of reverb or something. Yeah, it still sounds. No, you're fine. It sounds pretty cool. Alright, I'm ready. Are you all ready? Let's do this. Alright, go.
Going down, 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 down. I'm going down, 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 down. I got my big feet out the window and my hands on the ground. I'm going down, 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 down. I'm going down, down, down. I got my big feet out the window. Let me down and close that box door. Oh, let me down and close that box door. Well, we're going down to Chattanooga. I'm going down to Chattanooga.
How'd they get that out of our system?
The only thing that that's only you're good. And I don't know if you noticed or don't. Just try and
sounds like 2 much.
No, it's great. I just didn't remember to
During
do
like
it.
the first
It's
and
perfect.
stuff.
Yeah.
Do you mind? I do last year.
Well, it's just like
It's like I'm trying not too much into
it's C. It's like you're going down the scale, but then you skip, and then G. So yeah, you can't play that far. You can play on that. Just make sure that on Wednesday, try to hit that fill. It comes in at the same time. It comes in on the second one.
What do you guys think about the verses? I thought it sounded good.
I can't really hear him from here, but
Okay, I heard him from here.
I can hear myself barely, but
We'll get level.
should I just,
I heard it pretty good actually.
I mean, you're right in front of him, but
Yeah.
maybe it's your jacket. Your jacket's like.
For levels at the show, like to have something to like boost your solo.
Yeah, I was thinking. I was like, I wish I had like a solo boost or something.
Yeah. No. Try to get something. Definitely. I mean, even if you're using the Marshall has a foot switch. Yeah. Like
training.
I don't know if we should use this Marshall, but
Yeah, I can. Now it is.
or the Bandmaster.
The first time it was good, but he turned it up.
Was that too loose before your solo? Or was that?
no, I thought
I thought that was cool. I thought that was. I liked if you did. You cut out for a second and just both cut out.
You just saw like was that like some kind of diminished chord or
Yeah,
whatever?
I did a little.
It's like yeah, that was cool. I like that too, man. It's fucking weird. Like this is. I like when you like jam with a group of people. It's like people just start doing shit. It just sounds cool. It's all like.
I don't like this bass, but it should.
it's a riff, bro.
No, it's not actually. It's not.
Fisher or something.
It's like a. This is no. The fake riff's upstairs, bro. This is like a. I don't even know what this is.
Oh, sorry. Also, how many? What parts do you want me to do that?
Oh, that high one?
Yeah.
You can just throw the high one in when you think it'll fit good. Like, so at the end of the verse. Like, you definitely don't throw it in the middle of the verse.
Should I do it like any? Yeah, okay. Not during vocal.
Yeah. Well, any other time, definitely get it, though.
Where's the new G3?
Wait, I had a jacket.
You guys
What the hell? How's that impossible?
It's only the guitar player.
Did you not get that joke?
It took me a second.
No, he doesn't think.
I have no idea what he
I
is.
just thought it was funny.
He was being shady.
No, I knew he wouldn't think it was funny. That's why I was looking at him.
Nick, it's not G3 until we go like this.
But Noah's shady
Yeah, we
like
gotta-
that. He gets it, but he doesn't think it's funny, so he just acts like.
No, I just
No, he
didn't
thinks
think
it's funny.
I do?
He thinks it's funny that he acted like he doesn't think it's funny.
Now that's true.
Hey,
No,
see?
How'd that sound?
Now, does that mean the joke is funny though?
Donatella.
Does
Oh
not
shit, we
mean
have an audience. What's up?
We'd like to welcome you all. We'd like to welcome all of you. Thank you.
I really don't know how people play bass like that.
Alright, one more time. One more time.
I want some strap. I'll get the strap on.
Yeah, get you. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I beat you to it.
What do you want us to wear?
Oh yeah, that's a good idea.
You want us all in like different colors and then you guys, this is your show. And, like,
I'd say just everybody go off. I kind of have
Yeah,
to.
Oh, really?
I'm having everyone do
Ah, yeah, true.
Probably black.
Oh, yeah, fuck, wait.
I don't know.
that's a safe bet.
It's all black, dude. We're playing blue
Black?
song. We're playing blue song.
Yeah,
or
you wear
pink.
Dude, I wish I had like something nice.
I'll got a
pink to wear. That'd be cool.
I'll wear camo and you won't see me.
Yeah,
Ready? Let's go. No, dude, that kind of works. I play a pink guitar. That'd be cool. Pink guitar would be cool.
I love you.
No, I have. Let's go too. Cyrus, let's go too far. Let's go too loud.
I'm going down
Fucking A.
Fucking I fucked up the ending. I'm comfortable with that.
Yeah, we will get to Brian one time.
It's so up there. Like a couple parts that just need up.
That's a short
It's
enough
like
song.
so up there.
Twice for sound check. Since we're
I
going
didn't-
first,
I
we
was
have time at the end. They're gonna let us do what we want with the extra time. So
Right, I totally.
If we can do it, yeah. I just wouldn't bet on it just because it says that's a reversal that 3 to 5.
Thanks, Don. It's right at the top of my chest voice. I'm like up there on my chest voice.
Those last 2 lines were basically like, this morning just sounded kind of cool. Yeah. That was like,
Lots of sounding bad trying that before it started something.
first round's up.
That is. It's like the right shit.
I haven't tried this all night.
It's
Stay right in front of the lights. Just stay right in front of the lights.
like the Myers.
Yeah, you guys sound really good.
That's how you kind of, like.
That was very nice, Joe.
I don't, you know how you kind of feel that you're singing the right notes.
Yeah. And I've been trying to go off of that a little bit more than usual. I have my finger on some words, not so loud, but yeah, Jake taught me to that.
Jake taught me that. I think it's called take my handshake break or something.
The sea, the sky. Oh, I thought I was playing all blues. You and I, sea and sky, and you and I were all blue. Oh, shit. Oh, shit. Some blues are sad.
Is that all blues cases?
The sea. You know that? All shades, all hues, all blues. Some blues are sad. All blues.
Whereas an instrument, you don't have to worry about that sort of thing. And so composers, being the control freaks that they are, have a preference for instruments because they can do things with instruments that they can't ask of the voice. When you're playing a violin, you don't have to worry about your breath. So composers who had a lot more freedom when they worked with these instruments. Are there any other differences that you guys can note about this music between this and the Renaissance? Faster, very good. Much more lively.
Can I ask, were women able to play instruments at this point?
Thinking back, yes, they were. In fact, we're going to talk about a group of women that were performing around this time. So absolutely, yeah. And that came a lot with the schism with the Protestant Reformation.
Yeah, I think so.
Women became much more involved in music, not in the Catholic Church, but in pretty much all other walks of life.
Awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. Vivaldi, who we're going to talk about later, he's a priest, but he was in charge of an orphanage for women and for girls, and he actually, that was his whole thing, was he taught orchestra. He wrote most of his compositions for this ensemble. Are there any other questions? What about the meter? It's very steady, right? You can actually identify a beat. So that's another thing that separates this and the Renaissance music that we have been listening to. Now, some of the further characteristics of this music are going to be that there are new composition techniques. Obviously, the entire system of tonality has changed. They've gone from using modes to instead the major and minor system. On top of that, they've introduced the concept of meter. So we have 4/4 time, things like that. So composers had to develop new compositional techniques. So we're going to see a lot of experimentation on the part of composers, and we're going to see them being very theoretical in the way that they write. So while the melodies may be very beautiful, very entertaining, a lot of the music that we listen to is going to be very cerebral. There are also going to be new musical forms that are developed. There's going to be the development of opera. So opera, as we know it today, so modern opera, was introduced during this time. And then lastly, there's going to be the embellishment of the major-minor tonal system. So even though they're using major-minor keys, we're going to see composers experimenting with how they can introduce different forms of chromaticism into that.
What does cerebral mean in like a music kind of context?
So it means, or I guess the way that I meant it there would be that.
Sorry, I wasn't even trying to quote you.
No, it's totally fine.
I was trying to think of that.
Yeah, so in that particular context, I was using it in a sense to mean very focused on like the intellectual side of music, and maybe not as concerned with how it sounds. And that's, I hate to say that because I don't want to make it seem like they didn't care how it sounded, but somebody like Bach, for example, when he would sit down to write a piece, he would map out exactly what keys he wanted to change to and things like that before he even started, writing the music itself. And a lot of it was improvised. So he wasn't as concerned with writing something that was memorable or writing something for the audience. Instead, he was much more concerned with writing something that challenged him intellectually. Yeah. Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah, playing more of the numbers game, kind of, rather than like the artist side of it in some kind of way.
Absolutely, yes, exactly. We are going to look at one of the early arias in opera. Now, we're going to get much more in depth into these forms next class on Thursday. However, to give you guys just a basic idea of where all of this is going, there were various forms of what they called opera before the Baroque time period, but what they called opera does not constitute what we consider opera. Opera was a very loose term back then. However, during the Baroque time period, they introduced opera. They were influenced by the idea of ancient Greek music again. They had seen that the Greeks often talk about how their plays were not spoken, but actually were sung and accompanied by music. And so they're trying to imitate that. From this point going forward, from the Baroque time up until now even, opera music has to tick certain boxes. For example, every single line in the performance has to be sung. It has to be accompanied, voice accompanied by an orchestra, things like that. It has to be broken into separate acts. The story is usually tragic, though there are comic operas that we'll see along the way. These early operas, often because of their obsession with ancient Greek culture, were based on the mythology of the Greeks. This first aria we're going to listen to is one of the ones that's still incredibly popular, which is Dido's Lament by Henry Purcell. I want you to think how this differs from the vocal music that we listened to up to this point. Now this part here introduced what has become the lamento bass line. So we see this in a lot of different music, including Led Zeppelin's Dazed and Confused. So, what are some of the comparisons or differences that you can make between this and the vocal music that we've heard up to this point? Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of variations, and also I like to see that the rests are there, like kind of to like basically to give a breath, basically is there, and it also doesn't have like it doesn't go like the Gregorian chant where it does like the different like scales. I don't know how they did it, but like it like went up and then down and stuff. This is just a note.
Yeah. Right, yeah, so it uses modern notation. I like your point, though, that you made. It's much more conscious of the voice as an instrument, right? So aware of the limitations of the voice and compensating for that instead of just this idea of writing the music out and then everyone just kind of figuring out how it's going to be performed later on.
Face and be like, oh my god, I can't sing.
Right, absolutely. Brigitte, did you have?
I think it's really elongated. Like it's like her quarter notes are like half notes. It's like
Oh, yeah.
purposely so that you can feel it more. And it sounds a lot better to me than the older music because you can feel it. You can hear what she's saying.
Yeah, so there's a lot of self-expression, and I like your point that there's a lot of emotion here, which we can connect to as listeners. And then, what was your last point? I'm sorry. You said something. So it's in English, which makes it easier for us. Henry Purcell was British, so it's written in English, so we can connect to it for that reason. But even if we weren't, the lyrics come through a lot more, and you get a sense of what the composer was feeling, and so you can connect with it as a listener. Up to this point, the religious music that we're listening to, it's purposely esoteric. I mean, it's made to, huh?
I'm hungry.
You're hungry? I'm sorry to hear that, but sorry, you broke my train of thought. Esoteric because they're appealing to a higher power, whereas this music can be much more personal, and so the composer can share what they're personally feeling, and so we're able to connect with that much more. It's more human than it is godlike, which is what everything we've heard up to this point. Yeah.
I know like pedal tones have obviously been around for a long time, but did Baroque music make like the pedal tone as like a concept, like, oh, we're ending in a cadence, like we're going to pedal this note to
Yes.
resolve?
Absolutely. In fact, that was a very common device that was introduced during this time.
Yeah.
I mean, you probably saw it in there
Yeah,
a
we're
little
just
bit where
dropping.
they're pedaling D.
Yeah.
They take it even further. That Bach piece that we listened to last class, the fugue with the organ, he used a pedal tone for, I want to say, like probably 16 measures, where he just hit one note that was in the upper part while the bottom moves steadily closer to it chromatically.
Could you say that's kind of like the beginning of like a vamp almost?
Yeah, to a certain extent.
Yeah, like that's like just at least
They
that kind
didn't
of
use a
feeling.
vamp the same way that we did, but yes.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
I would say that. Now, some of the elements of the music that we want to be conscious of, first and foremost, as I've talked about before, texture is, oddly enough, because we don't really consider it in today's music, we take texture very much for granted because so much of our music is homophonic. Texture is one of the most important musical elements that we're going to have in this class, especially this early portion of the class. The homophonic texture versus polyphonic is going to be one of the huge dividing lines for us as we listen to our music. For example, that last example there was homophonic because we had the voice part, which is very clearly the melody, and then the accompaniment was the instrumental section. It was very clear, the division. However, that handle part that the handle composition that we listened to earlier moves back and forth between polyphonic and homophonic. And the polyphonic texture is favored by composers in situations where they are trying to be much more complex and maybe a little bit more theoretical. Perry?
So, to be clear,
Yes.
on the test,
Yes.
the question about textures, a proper answer would have been referencing all the phonies, like polyphony, homophony, and like saying like you use this one to identify them.
Yes.
That would have been, because I had trouble with the texture.
Oh, for the quiz.
Yes.
That we just turned in. Yeah, so that's what I was looking for, was
Okay.
that you can use texture to tell you what time period it is, or to tell you what the composer was
Okay.
using. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah,
Okay.
I was having trouble with that question.
Did you figure it out?
No.
It's okay. So that's one that I know can be a little bit of a struggle, and especially this semester, we moved quickly through those things. So if I notice ever that we have a quiz or a test and a lot of people get one question wrong, I usually give credit for that question because it usually tells me that either I didn't teach it right or it's worded wrong. So don't ever, if there's something that, and you're looking at the test and you're like, I have no idea, and it seems like everybody else you talk to doesn't have an idea, trust that I'll probably end up giving you credit just because I realize that the fault probably lies with me. All right, so yeah, to answer your question, that's pretty much what I was looking for, was what I was discussing there.
Yeah, because I put in my notes the different parts of a piece specific to the Baroque period. Is that wrong for texture? That's not right, right?
You're moving in the right direction there. So the texture does refer to the different sections of the piece and how they interact, or I should say the different instruments and how they interact. As far as the Baroque period,
Instruments. Got it.
yeah, the Baroque period is just interesting because with the Baroque period we see this break where composers start to use different textures within the same composition.
So the Baroque period is when composers started. Okay.
Yeah, they're much more experimental with it. We have the major and minor scales that are being used. Major pieces tend to be happier, whereas minor pieces tend to be sadder. But during this time, they used a different system of tuning than the one that we use. Different keys would sound out of tune to us because different notes were not tuned to A440. Instead, they'd be tuned in different ways. So different keys were used based on the emotion that they would elicit within the listener. And in fact, they actually had a manual for composers that would tell you if you wanted to convey this specific emotion, this is the key you should use, these are the techniques you should use. We're also going to see the introduction of two specific techniques that deal with accompaniment, which are called continuo and figured bass. Basso continuo, and this is really important, this is going to appear on quizzes and tests, so make sure you guys are listening, focused up here. Continuo refers to a repetitive bass part that is featured throughout the entire song. All right, so the basso continuo is a repetitive bass part that is featured throughout an entire composition. Their job is not just to outline the harmony, but to also establish the rhythm. Think of it almost like a walking bass line in jazz. In fact, there's a lot of interplay between Baroque music and jazz. A lot of the jazz musicians, especially the early jazz musicians, credit Baroque music with being an influence. The walking bass line is establishing the harmonic foundation of the composition and also establishing the rhythm. Figured bass is a system of notation that composers would use to tell the basso continuo player what to play. Like a walking bass line, the basso continuo was improvised. So, for example, is that his real hair? No.
Okay.
No, they wore wigs. It was like a sign of. It was a sign of aristocracy and like your class. So like the bigger your wig and the more extravagant your wig, the more.
So they hate women, but they want to look like
to a certain extent. Yeah.
You want to go wig shopping this weekend?
Now, if I'm looking at like a jazz chart as a bass player, I'm usually given just a lead sheet, something like this, where
Did they use Roman numerals then or no?
no. I'm given something like this. What do these letters and numbers tell me?
The chord.
No, chord, yeah. So it's telling me what chord is being performed, but specifically I can choose whatever notes I want to play as a bass player based on that chord. So I know that for a C7, for example, I can play C, E, G, or B flat. Those are all notes within the chord, and then I figure out the rest. So they're giving me the basic harmonic foundation, but I'm choosing how I want to perform that.
Are those lines notes supposed to be notes? Notation?
No, these are railroad tracks, and these just denote that that chord should last for 4 beats. Now, occasionally, you will get something like this, where they want you to play a specific rhythm there, and so they're telling you, okay, the rhythm you got to play is 1, 2, and 3, 4, but yet again, they're still not telling me specifically which notes they want me to play where, just that I have to play this specific rhythm. Now, to answer your question about Roman numerals,
Because I'm a jazz bassist, so
Okay.
I was totally interested in this. I was like,
yeah, so what they got instead was this. Now, the melody would be performed as it's written. However, the continuo player was being told that this is the root of the chord, and then these numbers below it symbolize the intervals above that particular bass note. So it's a more sophisticated way of writing this. So for example, this is an A flat, but you're stacking a 6th and a 5th. So a 6th above A flat is F, a 5th is an E flat, and then you just naturally fill in the 5th which of the chord, which is a C. So this is an F minor 7 chord. So a performer who's versed in this would know that this is an F minor 7 chord, and they can play whatever they want, especially if they're not the bass player or they're not the harpsichord player. They don't have to worry about that bass note. They can play whatever note in the chord they want to play. If you don't have a number, it then means that that is just a root position chord. So this is a B flat chord. This is an F chord. So somebody who is performing the basso continuo part would look at this and it would tell them specifically what notes they had to choose from for their performance. But it is improvised. They're improvising their part. It's maybe not as loose or as free as what a jazz musician would do, but it serves the same function. Now we're going to listen to a few examples from this time. The specific things that I want you to listen for are what texture it is. Does the texture change? So is there more than one texture? That is possible. Is there a continuo part? Not every composition has continuo, but the way that you can tell it, is there a bass part that is performing on every beat, that the job of that bass part is to hold down the rhythmic function? The text relationship to the music, so if we are listening to a part with vocals, how are the vocals and the instrumental part interacting? What are the dynamics doing? And anything that stands out to you about the rhythm. All right, so this first one is by Yo-Yo Ma.
Ooh, love him.
This is the prelude from the first cello suite.
Wow. Yeah, yo, ma. That's my shit.
So, can somebody tell me what texture do you believe that composition is? I'm sorry? Why?
Because it's just a cello.
Okay.
So I felt like it's just one sound.
All right. Anybody agree, disagree, want to?
I agree with her. It kept being the same song over and over and over and over.
I would disagree with that. I feel like
No, it's the same.
there's very little repetition, actually. It doesn't really revisit any of the melodic ideas. While it's the same instrument and there are similar ideas, you know, we don't want to be reductive.
Yeah, the notes are just being interchanged, but they're not in the exact same synchronization
Yeah.
every time.
Casey?
I almost saw this like even before you said. I almost think it's like polyphonic in the sense that it acts as a bass. Like it's a bass line for half the song, but it's so melodic in the way it acts because like it's vamping the chords. Like it's just arpeggiating and it's going over the chord structure, just like that, where it's like this is the chord we're on, this is the chord we're on, these are the notes in the chord. Here's maybe a note or two that can actually flare it up, but it's doing it in such a melodic way that it's like. Even though one thing is being played, it's acting as a bass line, but it's also acting as a melody.
Okay. And so I like where we're going with this. So we have monophonic, polyphonic.
I was just gonna agree with what Casey was saying because it seems like even though there's only one instrument, you know, and he's like playing, there's like the higher melody lines, and then just for a moment. Even though it's the same instrument, and you would think since it's the same instrument that it would be considered mono, he adds in those low, like he cuts away from the kind of melody and goes and adds in those low notes and then goes back. And then like he was saying, and even though since it's one instrument, you would think that it would create one continuous mono line, I feel like there's definitely like poly in there because of the way he earned, you know, those random those, you know, I don't know all the technical terms. But, you know, those random striking of the chords, the lower chords, or notes, or, strings.
I like where you guys are going with this. So, this is one of those instances where it's a matter of perspective. Because you're absolutely right. If we are looking at this, you know, in a very literal sense, I mean, it is monophonic. It is one melodic line. However, if we start to analyze the function of each note or each section or each part, we start to get the idea, as Casey and Perry were saying, that it could be a different texture. Now, me personally, and this is one of those instances where I don't think that there is a solid answer to this because it really depends on how you view that bass part. I personally feel it's more homophonic because I feel like the bass part in a lot of places is too static to be considered its own independent melody. But I like in general, because like I said, there is no right or wrong answer. I like in general that we are starting to break into this idea of analyzing what exactly is happening in the music and why is it happening this way. I once heard somebody talk about painting in this way, and I thought that for being so simple, it is, and you guys might laugh because maybe you already think this way, but I thought it was really, really insightful. But somebody, when they were talking about analyzing painting, said nothing in a painting is a mistake. It is there because the painter made a decision to put it there. So therefore, every brush stroke you have to view as a decision on the part of the artist. And I feel like music that's not improvised, like that music right there, which is written, every single note is there for a reason. The composer made the decision to put that note there. And so we have to analyze it as such. He decided to write this music for solo cello, even though it's very active. And so we have to analyze, well, why is it written this way? Why does it keep jumping back and forth between the bass part and the higher part of the cello? So very good. I like that you guys are thinking that way. Here's another composition.
Is Yo-Yo Ma the only person that
Wait,
plays
so
that?
I have a question.
It's allowed to.
So it is possible to have an instrument, just one single instrument, only one person playing it, but it can also be polyphonic or homophonic.
Yes, but it's especially prevalent on string instruments and keyboard instruments. You know what? Think about why. Why would it like that could be for cello, but if you try to do something similar with the clarinet, it may not be as simple. Why does it work? Like, why does that concept work on the cello, but maybe not on the clarinet? Yeah, go ahead.
I kind of feel like with strings, it's so much more, a lot more possibilities of chords and keys and stuff that you can do.
Yes. So yeah, you can play chords. You can play more than one note at a time, like he did at the end and at the beginning. So you can establish that harmony. Same thing with a keyboard instrument, especially. And then on top of that, they have a really wide range. So he's able to hit those bass notes and easily differentiate it between the higher notes. Whereas a clarinet has a much smaller range, and to jump between the low range and the high range is much more difficult. So yes, it is possible, but composers tend to pick and choose which instruments they do it with. Perry?
So I just like we were talking about it, and I said poly, and then you afterwards you said homo, and I just wanted, because it was just like those one little notes, and it wasn't like an ongoing lower bass line. That's why it would be considered homo instead of poly.
Yes.
Okay.
If the bass line was more active. Like,
Got
for
it.
example, there was that extended section where the bass line was a pedal tone, so it was the same note over and over. And so, therefore...
What does that mean, pedal? I wanted to ask
It's
earlier.
where you alternate between a higher note, or a part that's moving, and a part that stays stationary. So, pedal tone would be one note that's struck over and over while another part changes. It can be
Okay.
higher note or lower note. But in this instance, it was a lower note that did not change. And so that's Bach telling us this note is not as important as the part that's moving.
Okay.
While it serves a very important function, it's the same note over and over. It's not as melodic. It's not a moving part. And so for me, because of that fact, it moves into homo rather than poly. However, I've heard people debate this composition many times as far as texture goes, which is why I chose it, because you can define it in these different ways. There are some people who take it very literally, who, like Lemaitre said, it's monophonic. It is just one part, and then there are other people who look at it in the way we're looking at it. So, it's open for interpretation, but that was why I defined it as homo.
But I just wanted to be clear on why, and I think I got it, but I just wanted to double check.
Yeah. To be clear, and I want to make this clear again for everybody, for something to be polyphonic, the parts have to be of equal importance. So it has to be two parts that are equally active and that are equally drawing the audience's attention. Because there can be very melodic accompaniments, but there has to be very clearly both parts being very clearly of equal importance. Here's our next one. I want you guys to do the same thing. So we are considering the texture, what we're hearing rhythmically, melodically. Casey, another thing that you'll hear often during this time is an ostinato, which is a repeated part. Alright, I'm going to cheat a little bit because I want you guys to just know this. Listen to the accompaniment. That is the basso continuo. The way that the accompaniment is repetitively holding down the rhythmic, the rhythmic section of this so that the violin part can float above that and play all this really complex stuff. That cannot happen if there's no basso continuo. You cannot be that complex.
So I just want to understand correctly. Walking bass line, basso continuo. Like, are they interconnected, or are they different things? Or
So they are different things, but the basso continuo helped to influence the establishment of the walking bass. Walking bass is strictly a jazz thing, but it is a good metaphor for what the basso continuo is. So just to make that clear, walking bass is influenced by the basso continuo, but it's a much more modern term. It's a much more modern approach to it. Huh?
That was awesome.
Oh, it's Hilary Hahn concerto for two violins.
What's the BWV part?
Oh, okay.
Because I've like done chorale
Yeah.
for BWVs before.
So BWV is essentially an opus number for Bach. They didn't start assigning opus numbers yet, and if they did, Bach didn't necessarily publish his works because he just worked in this like local church his whole career. And so BWV refers to, I forget his name, but BWV stands for he's the guy who essentially cataloged all of Bach's music. And so instead of having an opus number, it's his initials.
There's a lot of BWV Bach pieces that are super popular on brass chorales and stuff.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, because I know I've played some of those before.
Yeah.
Fun.
Just one quick thing, kind of random side note. There's a really good Yo-Yo Ma movie. If you guys ever get the chance to watch it, it's called Music of Strangers.
Yes, I've seen
And
it.
I've watched it like 2 or 3 times. It's just really good. If you consider yourself like a music person, you should definitely watch that movie.
I
Like,
second that 100%.
yeah, for sure.
So today, at this point now, we're going to start looking at some of the different forms that were used during this time. One of the most prominent was the concerto. Now, the concerto refers to a composition that's written for a soloist who is being accompanied by the orchestra. And I want to emphasize once again that what I'm referring to here is the soloist performing a complex solo part, and the orchestra is simply there to accompany them. So the soloist on top, the orchestra on below them as far as the hierarchy. Now there is a concerto, which is for a single soloist, or there is a concerto grosso, which is a composition for a small group of soloists who are accompanied by the orchestra. So it is possible to have more than one soloist. Now, the entire point of a concerto is that it is designed to show off the soloist's ability. So the music is usually very complex. It's usually very difficult to play, and it's usually very fast. Now, there are fast and slow movements, but even during the slow movements, the soloist tends to usually play very fast parts.
So this could be considered strictly monophonic?
Yes. Even when there are parts that may seem polyphonic because the soloists are playing different things, it's still considered homophonic because the soloist as a group, their part, is considered to be of more importance than the orchestra, which makes it a little confusing sometimes. Like I said, it can be a little tough because it feels very much like the composers will jump between polyphonic and homophonic at will. So it can be a little difficult, but as a general rule with concerto, we consider it to be homophonic. We are going to listen to a couple examples of this. The first one is strictly a concerto because it is written for one individual soloist. This is Itzhak Perlman performing the solo violin part in Vivaldi's Four Seasons, and this movement is Spring. Now, you notice that the violin soloist is conducting the group here. Conductors, as a general rule, were not prominently used during the Baroque time period. In fact, often the concertmaster, which is the first violin section leader, or in this case a soloist, will actually direct the beginning and end of the song. And it's the job of the basso continuo to hold everything together rhythmically. So to just re-emphasize that, conductors were not as prominent during this time. You're not going to see very many of them. And instead, it's some musician on the ensemble who is directing the group. This is Spring from Vivaldi's Four Seasons.
Yeah,
It's on Chroma.
This is like used on so many different movies.
Even little
Yeah.
icons.
Yeah.
Yes.
From
What is dancing? Well, who was the first composer? Like composer.
That would be tough. The first composer to compose in the Baroque style. We're going to talk about this in class, but probably the one who at least established like what it means to be a Baroque composer was Monteverdi, Claudio Monteverdi, who we'll talk about later. Now, this is a concerto grosso. There are going to be multiple soloists accompanied by the orchestra. So we have two violins and a lute. Huh? They're different sizes. It's kind of like a recorder. Like even though we use a soprano recorder today, there are actually many different size recorders.
I've never seen a loop that big. I think it's huge.
That's what they always tell me. Nothing else in my joke. My head said out loud.
The loop? Yeah, the loop. So to go along with this idea of the concerto being all about demonstrating great skill, it was during this time that we see the rise of what's called a virtuoso. Now, the virtuoso is someone who is considered to be not just really great at their instrument, but one of the best during their time. So virtuoso is very specific, and there's usually a very limited number of people who are considered to be virtuosos. Now, during this time period, because, as we talked about earlier, instruments became much easier to use, for the first time, people could become quite good at playing their instruments. And so we see a rise in music that's written specifically for the opportunity to show off those newfound skills. Now, we're going to listen to a few examples in modern music that I believe show virtuosity. For each of these, I want you to think about a couple things. First of all, as we listen to each group, what do they all have in common? Secondly, what are the different types of virtuosity you see being demonstrated? Because virtuosity isn't just necessarily performing quickly. We often think of that as being, this prerequisite towards virtuosity, but it's more than just that. What does virtuosity entail? And we already started to touch on this, but why do you think that there was greater virtuosity during this time? So this first example is the saxophone player Charlie Parker and the trumpet player Dizzy Gillespie, who are two of the first musicians in jazz who really pushed into the area of virtuosity with bebop. They wanted to write music that was specifically, it was exclusive. They wanted to exclude other musicians. They wanted to make a music that was so difficult that only a set handful of musicians could perform it. That's Charlie Parker.
Guys,
Does it relate to the questions?
it relates to no. That's,
Sorry, just wait till after because I want to wait until we've seen all examples before we discuss it. Next is Jimi Hendrix performing the national anthem at Woodstock in 1969. What?
That's just my opinion. That's too much.
That's the king right there.
If I'm at a football game, like,
He's
There's not a football game.
I was about to say he's not at a football game.
I'm just saying, if they would do something like this at a football game, you know.
But he not. He at a party where everybody tripping on acid, man. He literally at a party where everybody tripping on acid, man. Like,
in the middle of the Vietnam War.
We're starving
There's-
to death on the
there's-
blood field.
So, you're absolutely right. We do take the location of a performance into context, but that's the thing. We have to look at this from the context. This is 1969. He's at a music festival. Hendrix, what a lot of people don't realize, Hendrix's relationship to Vietnam and things like that was much different than a lot of the other performers at the time, because Hendrix just barely missed out on going to Vietnam. He was a member of the 101st Airborne in the Army. And in his very last jump to earn his wings, he broke his leg severely, compound fracture, and so he's medically discharged from the military. So, unlike a lot of the other performers at the time, Hendrix had, actual experience within the military, and so while he's performing the national anthem, and a lot of people saw this as a anti-war thing, we don't necessarily know Hendrix's reasoning behind this because he himself never really spoke out definitively on his stance with it, and it was a little bit more of a complex thing. So, he's putting not necessarily just this anti-war thing into it, but he's trying to give the audience the experience of, what his thinking was on it through the music rather than definitively saying it with words. Now, this next one we're going to look at is David Diggs. This is a song called Easy Come, Easy Go from his movie Blind Spotting.
You all getting so Pacino when I'm counting my dinero, leading Lennon, that's a Beatle, Laura revolutionary, red like a blood on the block, I'm bleeding, I walk like Crippen, I talk like Pimpin', I rock like Rick, and I got my keys in the lock like keys to a rock, I'ma flip my talk, and I take my time, and I take their times, and I make their minds, I rate, and I write, and I wait for the rest of the world to find my pace, and I pace in the room, need space like a bulldog, make cartoons, get about my face, get off my case, cause I ain't seen a box yet, I can't break, bitch.
It's like they really trying to sing it up. I don't know what the fuck they want to see me for. This rapping shit is easy coming.
So, what are some of the things that these examples have in common? So, what are some of the commonalities we see between them? Yes, Isaiah.
Not only speed, but it's like if someone else was to try to do it, it would be very difficult, even if they're very experienced in that field. So it's like perfecting something that no one else can do and doing it at like the peak of your ability, like trying rapper, he did it lyrically and did it, added probably a couple of metaphors and stuff that would go over a lot of people's heads. The bass player did something that a lot of other bass players probably wouldn't be able to do unless they had years of experience. But even then, they would still have to practice. And the saxophone player did a lot of stuff that a lot of other saxophone players, even if they're very experienced, wouldn't be able to do in the breath like he would have been able to do.
Yeah, I think that you touched on something specific there, or really good there, which is that each person has a very specific thing that they're doing very well, and something that really sets them apart from their peers. Very good. Arande?
Yeah, I don't agree with Isaiah says. It's like they got their own unique style, but they doing what everybody kind of know, but they putting their own twist on it.
Okay, good. So that they're, even though they're all demonstrating great technical ability, there is an extra layer there that has to do with them having their own personal ability, so their own personal touch that makes it special, that makes it unique. What else did they share? What are some of the other things, or we can even start branching into the idea of what are some of the elements of virtuosity? Because it's not just that speed, obviously. Yes.
I feel like they want to, as an artist, you always want to challenge yourself, and so I believe that they're trying to do that in a way. And they're, with the rapper, he was like, keep on going and going and going and going with no breath.
Yeah.
Insane. But I think, sorry, what was your question again?
I think that you're touching on it. So, but essentially, it's what is virtuosity? Like, what are some of the things that we look for in virtuosity? I think you touched on it.
Yeah, the challenge of like the whole. I think it's more like a. They want to amaze others, but I think it's more like a personal thing where you want to get better and better until you're able to do that and just say, yeah, no one else has done this before.
Good. Blair?
Oh, no.
Oh, sorry. I thought you were raising your hand. I thought they were.
Oh, no. I was just with my team in real life.
All right. Besides speed, what are some of the other things that were virtuosic in their performance? Perry?
They probably came up with ideas or techniques that hadn't been seen before.
Yeah, absolutely. Hendrix actually played with his back to the audience sometimes because he was using techniques that he himself had developed, and he didn't want other people to see what he was doing so that they could.
Man, that's how I be feeling when I play drums. I don't want nobody.
You don't want people to see.
Like this question 24/7, bro. How you be doing all that?
Yeah.
No.
But yeah, so it's developing their own approach. Daveed Diggs isn't just a quick rapper. He has a very specific cadence that he uses and a very specific sound. He doesn't just rap quickly, but it's very clearly enunciated, and he uses the consonants almost as if they were percussion. And so he's sometimes creating rhythms within the words that he's saying, kind of like Isaiah was saying, using the lyrics in a much more musical way, and in a way that, as you said, adds a depth to the music. Anything else stand out to you as being virtuosic from these examples?
Just amazing.
Yeah, it's all just amazing. It's things that make you kind of sit back and go, wow, I cannot believe somebody's able to do that.
Well, they really did do that, huh?
So before the next class, what I want you to start doing, if you are doing the reading, read the chapter up to 233, so the chapter on Baroque for Thursday, sorry. And then I want you to try to come up with a composer that you're leaning towards for the paper. Now, as I've mentioned before, the due date for telling me your composer is not until the paper is actually due. But the sooner you come up with a composer, the easier this is going to be, especially because starting on Thursday, we're going to begin talking about specific composers. So I can give you material to write your paper. For example, if let's say you're writing about Bach, we're going to talk about Bach, we're going to talk about Vivaldi, we're going to talk about Handel in Thursday's class, and so that can give you a start with those composers, but you wouldn't necessarily know that unless you know who you're writing about. So start looking into those composers, try to come up with somebody by Thursday. If you don't have any questions, I will see you guys on Thursday.
Is Thursday the due date for the paper?
No.
Wait, I'm confused. You said it. Well, no, that's what. Because you said it's not due until the day.
Nothing is due Thursday.
Oh, that's why I just freaked out.
Yes, nothing is due Thursday. Thursday. I'm just saying that it would be great if by Thursday.
Ah, got it. Okay. Okay.
He's
Okay.
like, you were in class on Thursday. Yeah, my policy. You were here when I went over it.